5 words. That's all it took to humiliate the most elite soldier America had ever produced, a Green Beret, a graduate of Fort Bragg, a man who had survived 3 combat deployments and trained with the finest special operations instructors on the planet. He stood there in the red dust of an Australian base camp, holding a survival kit that had cost American taxpayers a fortune to develop. And an Australian sergeant, a man from a country most Americans couldn't even find on a map, looked at that kit and said something that would haunt the Pentagon for the next 50 years. Throw that trash away, mate. Now here's what they don't want you to know. That Australian was right, and everything that happened afterward proved it in the most brutal, bloody, embarrassing way imaginable. The Pentagon buried the report. They classified the findings. They pretended this encounter never happened. Because if the American public ever found out the truth, it would shatter everything they believed about who really had the best special forces in the world. Today, I'm going to show you what they hid. I'm going to reveal why Australian soldiers with cheaper boots and simpler equipment were achieving kill ratios that made American units look like amateurs. I'm going to explain how one small nation's special forces made the mighty Green Berets question everything they'd ever been taught. This isn't just a story about a survival kit. This is a story about institutional failure, buried evidence, and lessons written in American blood that took decades to learn. Stay with me until the end. Because what that Australian sergeant knew, and what Washington tried to suppress, will change everything you thought you understood about the Vietnam War. The Australian sergeant didn't even look at the Americans' gear. He simply pointed at the rucksack stuffed with Pentagon-approved survival equipment, and uttered 5 words that would haunt Special Forces training manuals for decades. Throw that trash away, mate. The Green Beret, a veteran of 3 combat deployments and graduate of the most prestigious special operations school in the Western Hemisphere, stood frozen in the red dust of Nui Dat base camp. His survival kit had been assembled by the finest military logisticians in the world. It contained water purification tablets certified by Army Medical Command. It held emergency rations developed by nutritional scientists at Natick Laboratories. It featured a signal mirror engineered to flash sunlight across 12 miles of open terrain. And this sunburned Australian, wearing boots that looked like they'd been purchased at a discount store, was telling him to throw it all away. But that moment of humiliation was only the appetizer. The main course of professional devastation was still being prepared. That encounter in 1967 would become one of the most closely guarded embarrassments in American special operations history. Not because the Australian was wrong, but because everything that happened afterward proved he was catastrophically, humiliatingly right. The Green Beret's name has been redacted from official records, but veterans who served alongside Australian SAS operators during the Vietnam conflict remember the incident with crystalline clarity. The American had arrived at the Australian Task Force headquarters, expecting to teach these Commonwealth soldiers a thing or two about jungle warfare. After all, the United States Army had invested more than $400 million developing counterinsurgency doctrine. Fort Bragg alone employed over 3,000 instructors dedicated to unconventional warfare training. The American Special Operations community represented the accumulated knowledge of conflicts spanning from the Philippine insurrection to the Korean peninsula. What could a handful of soldiers from a country famous for kangaroos and sheep possibly teach the most technologically advanced military force in human history? The answer would shatter assumptions that had guided American military thinking since the end of the Second World War. But this revelation didn't come quickly or painlessly. It came through blood, through failure, and through a series of encounters so professionally devastating that the Pentagon would spend the next 5 decades trying to pretend they never happened. And the survival kit incident was merely the opening act in a drama of institutional humiliation. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment had arrived in Vietnam with a reputation that American intelligence officers found almost laughable. These were soldiers from a nation with a total population smaller than New York State. Their entire special operations community could fit inside a single American battalion. Their equipment budget for an entire year wouldn't cover the cost of one American helicopter squadron for a single month. Pentagon analysts who reviewed Australian military capabilities in 1965 produced assessments dripping with condescension. Adequate for support roles, one report concluded. Limited independent operational capacity. The recommendation was to assign Australian forces to perimeter security and civic action programs, keeping them safely away from serious combat operations. Nobody in Washington could have predicted how spectacularly wrong that assessment would prove to be. The Australians had other ideas. Within 6 months of their arrival in Phuoc Tuy Province, something extraordinary began appearing in the intelligence summaries that crossed American desks in Saigon. The Australian SAS, operating with patrols of just 4 or 5 men, was producing kill ratios that defied mathematical probability. Their casualty reports showed engagement after engagement where enemy losses numbered in double digits, while Australian casualties remained at 0. American liaison officers initially suspected the Australians were inflating their body counts, a practice unfortunately common among units desperate to demonstrate progress in a war measured by statistics. But when verification teams examined the evidence, they found something far more disturbing than exaggeration. The Australians were actually underreporting their results. And that discovery would trigger a chain of events that would lead directly to the Green Beret, standing with his worthless survival kit in the red dust of Nui Dat. But the real shock was still to come. When Pentagon analysts started asking how a force smaller than a single American regiment was outperforming divisions of U.S. troops, the answers they received challenged everything the American military believed about modern warfare. The Green Beret, who stood holding his suddenly worthless survival kit, was part of the first official American effort to understand Australian methods. His mission, classified at the time and only partially declassified decades later, was to embed with Australian SAS patrols and document their tactical procedures. The assumption in Washington was that the Australians had simply gotten lucky, or that their small area of operations allowed them to concentrate forces in ways unavailable to American units spread across the entire country. 6 weeks of direct observation would surely reveal their methods to be either impractical for large-scale implementation or dependent on circumstances unique to their limited operational zone. That assumption lasted approximately 4 hours. The Australian sergeant who told the Green Beret to discard his survival equipment wasn't being dramatic. He was stating a tactical reality that American military doctrine had completely failed to grasp. Every item in that carefully assembled kit, from the metal signal mirror to the waterproof matches to the emergency fishing line, represented a fundamental misunderstanding of how soldiers survive in hostile jungle environments. What the Australians said next made the Green Beret's blood run cold. The mirror would flash sunlight to attract rescue helicopters, the American explained. The Australian asked a simple question that made the Green Beret's stomach drop. What rescue helicopters? In the zones where SAS patrols operated, helicopter extraction was often impossible for days at a time. The jungle canopy was too thick. Enemy anti-aircraft positions made approach routes suicidal. And perhaps most importantly, calling for extraction meant admitting the patrol had failed. Australian SAS operators didn't plan for rescue. They planned for self-sufficiency measured not in hours, but in weeks. But the mirror was just the beginning of the Americans' education in inadequacy. The water purification tablets represented an even more damning indictment of American thinking. The tablets worked, certainly, but they required the soldier to stop moving, find water, treat it, wait the prescribed 30 minutes for purification, and then drink. That process created noise. It created a stationary target. It created predictability that enemy trackers could exploit. The Australians had learned from Aboriginal advisors how to identify plants that stored drinkable moisture. They knew which vines could be cut to release clean water directly into the mouth without stopping movement. They understood that in the jungle, the soldier who stops is the soldier who gets found. And still, the most devastating critique hadn't even been delivered yet. The most crushing blow came when the Australian examined the Americans' emergency rations. These packets of freeze-dried food, developed at enormous expense by military nutritionists, were designed to sustain a soldier for 72 hours while awaiting rescue. They provided precise caloric content, balanced macronutrients, and required only the addition of water for preparation. They represented the cutting edge of military food science. They were also, according to the Australian sergeant, a death sentence in the jungle. The smell. That single word explained everything. American field rations, no matter how carefully sealed, released odors when opened. In the humid jungle environment, those odors traveled with extraordinary efficiency. A trained tracker could detect the scent of American rations from remarkable distances. The Viet Cong had learned to follow their noses to American positions, and the distinctive smell of U.S. military food had become a targeting signature, as reliable as a radio beacon. But what the Australians ate instead would have horrified Pentagon nutritionists. The Australians consumed locally sourced food whenever possible, items that smelled like the jungle itself. They learned from indigenous scouts which plants provided nutrition without producing telltale odors. When they carried rations, they selected items specifically chosen for olfactory neutrality. The process of eating became not a break from the mission, but an extension of it, another element of the comprehensive concealment doctrine that defined Australian special operations. The Green Beret listened to this explanation with growing disbelief that slowly transformed into something closer to horror. Every piece of equipment he carried, every technique he'd been taught, every assumption underlying his training suddenly seemed not just inadequate, but actively dangerous. The American military had spent billions of dollars preparing him for a version of jungle warfare that existed only in theoretical models. The Australians had spent years learning from people who actually lived in jungle environments. The difference wasn't just tactical, it was philosophical. And this was merely the first day of what would become the most painful education of the Americans' career. The following morning brought fresh humiliations that made the survival kit incident seem almost gentle by comparison. The Green Beret received his introduction to Australian patrol procedures, and the education continued with relentless intensity. American doctrine emphasized aggressive patrolling, maintaining constant movement to avoid becoming a fixed target while covering maximum ground to locate enemy forces. Australian doctrine inverted this approach so completely that the American initially thought he'd misunderstood the briefing. The patrol would move for 50 minutes, then stop for 10. During those 10 minutes, they would remain absolutely motionless, not resting, listening. The American had been trained to see stillness as vulnerability. Every minute spent stationary was a minute when enemy forces could maneuver to encircle his position. Movement equaled safety. Movement demonstrated initiative. Movement was what aggressive, professional soldiers did. What the Australians understood about stillness would overturn everything the American thought he knew about jungle warfare. In the jungle, movement creates noise. Noise travels farther than the soldier making it realizes. An enemy hearing that noise gains information about direction, pace, number of personnel, and equipment. But a soldier who stops and listens, truly listens, can detect the enemy making the same mistakes. The 10-minute halts weren't rest periods. They were intelligence collection operations, and the information they provided was often more valuable than hours of aggressive patrolling. But the lessons about movement were only the beginning of the Americans' systematic re-education. This philosophy extended to every aspect of movement. American boots featured aggressive tread patterns designed to provide traction on varied terrain. Australian boots had been modified with smoother soles that left less distinctive tracks. American uniforms came in standardized camouflage patterns that worked well in temperate forests. Australian operators mixed and matched vegetation from their immediate environment, changing their camouflage multiple times daily as the flora shifted. American soldiers carried equipment arranged for quick access in firefights. Australian equipment was arranged to eliminate any possibility of metallic clicking or fabric rustling during movement. The Green Beret began to understand that he was witnessing not just different tactics, but an entirely different conception of what special operations meant. The American model emphasized striking power, the ability to bring overwhelming firepower to bear on enemy positions through superior technology and aggressive maneuvering. The Australian model emphasized something older and in some ways more frightening. They sought to become part of the jungle itself, invisible presences that could observe, track, and eliminate enemies without ever revealing their existence. The Americans brought the hammer. The Australians became the snake. And what the snake could do would terrify even the most hardened American operators. But the divergence ran deeper than equipment and movement techniques. It extended to the fundamental question of why special operations soldiers existed in the first place. American Special Forces doctrine in Vietnam emphasized unconventional warfare through indigenous force multiplication. Green Berets were trained to recruit, organize, and lead local fighters, transforming villagers into guerrilla armies that could challenge communist forces across wide areas. This approach had worked in the Second World War, when Office of Strategic Services operators coordinated resistance movements across occupied Europe. It had worked in Korea, where partisan forces behind enemy lines tied down divisions of Chinese troops. The doctrine was proven. The doctrine was sound. The doctrine was almost useless in Vietnam. And the reasons why would expose fundamental flaws in American strategic thinking. The Viet Cong had spent years developing their own networks in South Vietnamese villages. They knew who sympathized with the government and who could be recruited. They had family connections, shared history, and ideological bonds that American advisors couldn't match no matter how much money or equipment they provided. Worse, every local recruit represented a potential security compromise. The Americans kept discovering that their trained guerrillas were reporting to communist handlers, that their carefully planned operations were being leaked, that their indigenous force multiplication was multiplying enemy intelligence as effectively as friendly capabilities. The Australian solution to this problem was so radical that American commanders initially refused to believe it could work. The Australians rejected indigenous force multiplication almost entirely. Rather than trying to build local armies, the Australian SAS focused on direct action by small, self-contained teams that reported to no one except their own chain of command. Their security protocols bordered on paranoid by American standards. Their operational details were shared with indigenous personnel on a strictly need-to-know basis. Their concept of special operations wasn't about building networks. It was about surgical insertion of highly trained operators who needed nothing from the local population and trusted no one outside their immediate patrol. This philosophy had roots in Australian military history, extending back to the Boer War, where Australian scouts had developed a reputation for independent operations in harsh terrain. It had been refined during the Second World War in North Africa and the Pacific, where Australian commandos operated behind Japanese lines for months at a time without resupply or reinforcement. And it had been further honed by close study of British SAS methods, themselves derived from the brutal lessons of desert and jungle warfare across the declining British Empire. The Americans had technology, resources, and numbers. The Australians had institutional memory of how small groups of determined men survive and prevail in hostile environments without any of those advantages. But the gap between American assumptions and Australian reality was about to widen even further. The Green Berets' education accelerated over the following days, each lesson building on the last to construct a picture of warfare that American doctrine had never contemplated. The Australians showed him how they prepared their weapons, a process that consumed hours before each patrol. Every moving part was tested and retested. Every round of ammunition was individually inspected. The philosophy was simple and unforgiving. In the jungle, a weapon malfunction wasn't an inconvenience requiring field repair. It was a death sentence. The Australians treated their rifles with the reverence that medieval knights had shown their swords, because in the close confines of jungle combat, the rifle was indeed the weapon that determined life or death in fractions of seconds. What they demanded of their bodies was even more extreme than what they demanded of their weapons. The patrol schedules seemed designed to maximize human suffering. Australians operated on sleep cycles that American military medicine would have classified as actively harmful. 4 hours of rest was considered generous. Patrols lasting 10 or 12 days with minimal sleep were standard. The reasoning was again rooted in jungle reality. Regular sleep schedules created patterns. Enemies could learn to attack during the hours when American patrols were bedded down. The Australians denied their enemies this predictability by denying themselves the basic human need for consistent rest. But perhaps no aspect of Australian methodology disturbed the American more than their approach to contact with enemy forces. What he witnessed would challenge everything he believed about warrior ethics. American doctrine emphasized firepower and maneuver. When contact occurred, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Suppressive fire would pin the enemy while friendly forces maneuvered to flanking positions. Artillery would be called. Air support would be requested. The goal was to destroy the enemy through superior striking power, and the measurement of success was body count. The Australians often broke contact deliberately. This practice violated everything the American had been taught about aggressive pursuit and decisive engagement. When his patrol made contact with a Viet Cong unit, the Australian commander's first instinct was not to press the advantage, but to assess whether engagement served the mission's actual purpose. If the patrol's objective was reconnaissance, then a firefight compromised that objective regardless of how many enemies were eliminated. The information they'd gathered would be endangered during the chaos of combat. Their position would be revealed. Their continued presence in the area would become impossible. Better to disengage, report the enemy location, and let other assets handle the destruction? The American initially mistook this restraint for cowardice. He couldn't have been more wrong. This wasn't cowardice. The Australians would engage with terrifying ferocity when engagement served their purposes, but they refused to be drawn into fights simply because fights were available. They maintained focus on operational objectives with a discipline that American units, often measured by body counts and rewarded for aggression, found almost incomprehensible. The Green Beret documented all of this. He filled notebooks with observations about equipment, tactics, leadership, and psychology. He recorded interviews with Australian operators who described engagements in clinical detail that contrasted sharply with the dramatic narratives American soldiers typically provided. He gathered enough material to fill a substantial report that he expected would revolutionize American special operations training. What happened to that report would reveal something even more disturbing than Australian tactical superiority. The report disappeared into classified archives almost immediately upon submission. Decades later, veterans who served in advisory and liaison roles with Australian forces would describe similar experiences of institutional resistance to their observations. The lessons they'd learned, often paid for with American blood when Australian methods weren't adopted, vanished into a bureaucratic maze where they posed no threat to established doctrine or defense contractor relationships. The survival kit the Green Beret had been told to throw away remained standard issue for years afterward. The patrol procedures he documented were dismissed as unsuitable for American force structures. The philosophy of patient observation over aggressive engagement never penetrated training curricula designed around technology and firepower. But why would the Pentagon suppress information that could save American lives? The answer exposed a rot at the heart of military procurement. The reasons for this institutional failure were complex and revealing. American military culture in the 1960s was built on assumptions of technological superiority that the Australian experience directly challenged. Admitting that soldiers with cheaper equipment and simpler methods were outperforming American forces threatened not just professional egos, but entire industrial ecosystems. Defense contractors who sold those survival kits and those patrol rations and those heavy boots had political connections that small Australian modifications couldn't match. The American military-industrial complex was designed to solve problems by spending money, and the Australian solution to jungle warfare was to spend almost nothing. There were also questions of national pride that commanders found impossible to address publicly. The United States had entered Vietnam as the dominant military power on Earth. American forces had crushed Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. American technology had split the atom and reached towards space. The notion that sheep farmers from the far side of the Pacific might possess operational wisdom unavailable in the Pentagon was not merely inconvenient. It was psychologically intolerable for leaders who had built careers on assumptions of American superiority. So the lessons were classified, the comparisons were suppressed, and American soldiers continued falling in engagements that Australian methods might have prevented. But the truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply institutions try to bury it. The Australians themselves seemed unsurprised by this response. Their military culture had long experience with being underestimated by larger allies. During the First World War, Australian forces had been dismissed as colonial irregulars until their performance at Gallipoli and the Western Front forced recognition. During the Second World War, Australian troops had been written off by British commanders who then watched them hold the line against Japanese advances that overwhelmed supposedly superior forces. The pattern was familiar. The larger ally assumed superiority, ignored Australian methods, suffered accordingly, and then, gradually, reluctantly, began paying attention. Vietnam followed this pattern with tragic precision, and the statistics told a story that no amount of institutional denial could permanently suppress. American casualties mounted through 1967 and 68, while Australian losses remained remarkably contained. American units reported contact after contact, where enemy forces seemed to anticipate their movements, while Australian patrols consistently achieved surprise. American operations produced body counts that satisfied statistical requirements but failed to degrade enemy capabilities, while Australian operations disrupted Viet Cong logistics and command structures with lasting effect. The numbers eventually became impossible to ignore entirely. By 1969, American Special Operations Commands were quietly sending observers to Australian positions with increasing frequency. The official purpose was always described as liaison coordination or intelligence sharing. The actual purpose was learning, though the learning was never officially acknowledged. American sergeants returned from Australian attachments with modified equipment and new techniques that they implemented in their own units, attributing the changes to personal innovation rather than Australian instruction. A quiet revolution in American special operations methods began percolating from the bottom up, even as top-level doctrine remained unchanged. But this underground transformation faced resistance at every level. The Green Beret, who had been told to throw away his survival kit, eventually completed his tour and returned to Fort Bragg. His classified report remained buried, but his personal knowledge proved impossible to suppress entirely. He became an instructor at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center, where he began incorporating Australian concepts into training exercises. He couldn't officially credit the source of his innovations, so he presented them as developments from his own combat experience. The deception was necessary because acknowledging Australian origins would have triggered institutional resistance that could have ended the methods entirely. This pattern of covert adoption repeated across American special operations communities throughout the early 1970s and 80s. Veterans who had served alongside Australian forces recognized superior methods when they saw them. They brought those methods back and implemented them through informal channels that bypassed official doctrine. They created a shadow curriculum of Australian-influenced methods that coexisted with formal training programs, available to those who knew where to look and whom to ask. Some of these veterans rose to positions of institutional influence, where they could finally implement changes they'd first learned decades earlier. Others remained at operational levels, passing knowledge directly to new generations of special operators who absorbed Australian lessons without knowing their origins. The flow of influence was invisible to institutional historians who tracked only official doctrine revisions, but it was real and significant nonetheless. But the most important Australian contribution to American military evolution wasn't tactical at all. It was philosophical, and it would take decades to fully appreciate. The American model treated special forces as force multipliers, soldiers whose value came from their ability to extend the reach of conventional military power. Special forces trained indigenous armies. Special forces conducted raids that shaped battlefields for regular units. Special forces operated in advance of main force operations, preparing the way for the decisive engagement that conventional troops would deliver. The Australian model treated special forces as strategic instruments entirely distinct from conventional operations. Australian SAS patrols didn't prepare battlefields for larger forces. They constituted the operation itself. Their presence in enemy-controlled territory created effects that didn't require follow-on conventional engagement. They gathered intelligence that could be acted upon by air power or artillery without ever requiring ground force commitment. They disrupted enemy operations through presence alone, forcing the Viet Cong to divert resources toward countering a threat they could never quite locate. This conception of special operations would eventually reshape American military thinking, but the transformation required decades and another generation of conflicts before taking hold. And the cost of that delay would be measured in American lives that didn't need to be lost. The lessons of Vietnam were processed slowly, filtered through bureaucratic resistance and institutional pride. It wasn't until the 1980s that American Special Operations Commands began formally acknowledging what Australian forces had demonstrated in the 1960s. And it wasn't until the post-September 11th era that Australian methods became fully integrated into American doctrine. The irony was bitter for veterans who had tried to communicate these lessons when they were freshly learned. The survival kit that the Australian sergeant had dismissed as trash in 1967 was still being issued, virtually unchanged, well into the 1980s. The patrol procedures that had produced Australian success were still being taught as impractical by American instructors who had never served alongside SAS operators. The philosophy of patient observation over aggressive engagement remained heresy in an institutional culture that measured performance through body counts and engagement reports. The cost of this delay is impossible to calculate precisely, but estimates suggest it was substantial. American special operations personnel perished in contacts that Australian methods might have prevented. Operations failed because of security compromises that Australian protocols were designed to eliminate. Intelligence opportunities were missed because American patrols moved too fast and too noisily to detect what patient Australian observation would have revealed. And the Australians watched all of this with a mixture of frustration and resignation that their American counterparts found infuriating. But the relationship between the two nations' special operators was more complicated than simple frustration. It contained elements that would only become clear years later. The relationship between American and Australian Special Operations Forces during this period was marked by professional respect, complicated by cultural friction. Americans admired Australian operational results while struggling to accept the implications those results carried for American self-perception. Australians appreciated American resources and firepower while growing increasingly impatient with American resistance to obvious improvements. The two communities worked together effectively at the operator level, where professional competence transcended national pride. But at higher levels, where doctrine was written and budgets were allocated, the relationship remained troubled by issues that neither side could openly address. Part of the difficulty was structural, and this structural problem would plague reform efforts for decades. American special operations in the 1960s operated under conventional military command structures that subordinated their unique capabilities to the needs of regular force commanders. Australian SAS maintained an independent command chain that protected their operational methods from interference by officers who didn't understand their purpose. This organizational difference meant that even when American operators learned Australian techniques, implementing them often required defying the conventional commanders to whom they reported. The Green Beret who tried to discard his survival kit faced this problem directly upon returning to Vietnam for a subsequent tour. His modified equipment and new patrol procedures worked brilliantly when applied to missions he controlled. But when assigned to support conventional operations, he found himself forced back into the old methods by commanders who measured success through metrics that Australian approaches couldn't satisfy. Aggressive patrolling produced the engagement reports that battalion commanders wanted to see. Patient observation produced intelligence that couldn't be easily quantified for performance reviews. The institutional incentives pushed constantly toward the methods that produced measurable activity, even when that activity was tactically counterproductive. This tension between what worked and what the system rewarded would plague American military operations for generations. But one incident would crystallize the problem with devastating clarity. The Australian approach offered a potential resolution, but it required accepting assumptions about military professionalism that American institutional culture resisted. The Australians trusted their operators to define success in terms appropriate to each mission, without requiring quantifiable metrics that higher headquarters could evaluate from distant offices. This trust was built on a selection and training process that produced operators whose judgment could be relied upon, even when their decisions couldn't be externally verified. The Australian system assumed that soldiers would make good choices because they were good soldiers, not because they were being monitored and measured by supervisory systems. American military culture had evolved in a different direction, toward ever more elaborate systems of oversight and accountability that assumed good decisions would emerge from proper procedures rather than individual judgment. This approach had advantages in preventing abuses and ensuring consistency, but it also created rigidity that made adaptation to local conditions difficult and slow. Australian operators could modify their methods instantly based on battlefield feedback. American operators needed to request approval through chains of command that often didn't understand what they were asking or why it mattered. The survival kit incident encapsulated this broader dynamic in miniature, and what it revealed about American military procurement would shock anyone who examined it closely. The American kit had been developed through careful procedural analysis, tested in controlled environments, and approved by multiple levels of authority. Every item had documentation justifying its inclusion. Every specification reflected input from experts in relevant fields. The result was a product of bureaucratic excellence that was also nearly useless in actual jungle operations. The Australian approach to survival equipment was almost impossible to document procedurally. Each operator modified his kit based on personal experience, mission requirements, and advice from more experienced colleagues. The result was a collection of items that varied from soldier to soldier and patrol to patrol, utterly unsuitable for standardized procurement, but remarkably effective for the specific challenges each operator faced. The system trusted individuals to solve problems that bureaucratic processes couldn't adequately address. The contrast between these approaches illuminated something fundamental about military effectiveness that neither side fully articulated at the time. Complex adaptive environments like jungle warfare resist standardized solutions. The information needed to make good decisions exists at the point of action, not at headquarters distant from the battlefield. Systems that concentrate decision authority far from that information necessarily produce inferior results compared to systems that push authority to the operators who possess immediate knowledge. The Australians had arrived at this understanding through institutional history that included numerous experiences of operating independently without higher headquarters support. Their military tradition included outback patrols, Pacific Island campaigns, and desert operations, where small units succeeded or failed based entirely on decisions made by sergeants and lieutenants beyond communication range of any superior authority. This history had produced a culture of distributed decision-making that happened to be ideally suited for special operations in denied environments. The American military had evolved differently, shaped by industrial-age warfare where massed forces required centralized coordination, and victory went to the side that could most efficiently concentrate firepower at decisive points. This history had produced a culture of hierarchical control that worked brilliantly for conventional operations, but struggled to adapt when the operational environment required the distributed approach that Australian experience had already developed. Understanding this cultural dimension helps explain why the survival kit lesson was so difficult for the American military to absorb. But the real reason went even deeper than culture. Discarding the standard kit wasn't just a tactical decision. It was a rejection of the entire system that had produced that kit, a statement that individual operator judgment was superior to institutional process. For a military built on procedural compliance, this was heresy of the first order. The Green Beret, who followed the Australian sergeant's advice, was taking a professional risk that his institutional superiors might not forgive. If something went wrong on a patrol where he'd abandoned official equipment, the consequences for his career would be severe, regardless of whether the equipment would actually have helped. The safe choice was to carry the useless kit, document its presence in required equipment lists, and trust that institutional compliance would provide cover if operations went poorly. The Australian system eliminated this perverse incentive by trusting operators rather than procedures. Australian sergeants who modified their equipment based on operational experience were praised for innovation rather than punished for deviation. Australian officers who adopted unorthodox methods that produced results were promoted rather than sidelined. The institutional rewards aligned with operational effectiveness rather than procedural compliance, which allowed good practices to spread rather than being suppressed. Decades later, American Special Operations Commands would begin implementing similar reforms, creating protected spaces where operators could experiment with methods that conventional forces would never approve. But during the Vietnam era, such protected spaces barely existed, and the absence of those spaces would cost more lives than anyone cared to count. American Special Forces operated under the same institutional constraints as regular infantry, with all the limitations that implied for adapting to unconventional warfare. The Australians had no such constraints because their entire force structure was already unconventional by American standards. The Australian military was small enough that institutional rigidity had never accumulated to the same degree. Officers knew their soldiers personally. Feedback flowed through informal channels that bypassed official reporting structures. Good ideas could spread through direct conversation rather than requiring formal doctrine revision. The smallness that Americans initially dismissed as weakness turned out to be strength in the specific circumstances of counterinsurgency operations. This insight about the relationship between organizational size and adaptive capacity would eventually influence American military reform efforts, though not until decades after Vietnam. The recognition that smaller, more agile units could outperform larger, more hierarchical organizations in certain types of operations became central to special operations transformation in the 1980s and beyond. But during the 1960s, such ideas remained too radical for mainstream military acceptance. The survival kit sitting in the red dust of Nui Dat base camp represented more than just inadequate equipment. It represented an entire military philosophy that was failing on the battlefield while succeeding in headquarters evaluations. The American system produced excellent documentation of systematic processes. The Australian system produced excellent results with minimal documentation. The conflict between these approaches would define military reform debates for generations. And at the center of that conflict stood ordinary soldiers like the Green Beret, who had to choose between institutional safety and operational effectiveness. The choice they made would determine who lived and who perished. Some chose compliance and carried equipment they knew was useless. Others chose effectiveness and lived with career consequences that institutional observers would never fully appreciate. A few managed to find ways to satisfy both demands, maintaining official equipment lists while actually using Australian methods in the field. The Australian sergeant who delivered the original verdict on American survival equipment probably never knew how much controversy his 5 words would generate. For him, the statement was simply obvious. The equipment was bad. It would get the American who carried it into trouble. Telling him to discard it was an act of professional concern, not institutional critique. But the implications of that concern rippled outward through American military structures in ways that neither he nor the Green Beret could have anticipated. The networks of veterans who had served alongside Australian forces became informal channels for doctrinal innovation throughout the 1970s and 80s. They shared techniques through personal correspondence, training exercises, and professional conferences where official doctrine couldn't reach. They created a shadow curriculum of Australian-influenced methods that coexisted with formal training programs, available to those who knew where to look and whom to ask. Some of these veterans rose to positions of institutional influence where they could finally implement changes they'd first learned decades earlier. Others remained at operational levels, passing knowledge directly to new generations of special operators who absorbed Australian lessons without knowing their origins. The flow of influence was invisible to institutional historians who tracked only official doctrine revisions, but it was real and significant, nonetheless. But the moment when Australian influence finally became impossible to deny was still years away. By the time American special operations underwent comprehensive transformation in the 1980s, the groundwork had been laid by this informal network of Australian-influenced veterans. The creation of Special Operations Command as an independent unified command reflected organizational principles that Australian experience had validated decades earlier. The emphasis on operator judgment over procedural compliance drew directly from methods that American observers had documented in Australian units. The survival equipment eventually issued to American special operators incorporated modifications, first developed by Australian sergeants, who found Pentagon-approved kits unsuitable for actual jungle operations. The Green Beret, who had been told to throw away as trash, eventually saw many of his lessons institutionalized, though often without acknowledgement of their origins. The classified report he'd submitted disappeared, but the knowledge it contained found other paths to influence. His career survived the unorthodox choices he'd made in Vietnam, largely because his operational results spoke louder than his equipment discrepancies. He became one of many veterans whose personal experiences shaped institutional evolution in ways that official histories would never capture. The Australian sergeant returned to his own country after completing his tour, carrying memories of engagements that Australian military historians would later study in detail. His assessment of American equipment became part of the informal lore passed between Australian operators, a story that illustrated the gap between bureaucratic procurement and operational reality. The specific survival kit that prompted his dismissal has long since been redesigned, but the institutional dynamics that produced it remain active in military procurement systems worldwide. And those dynamics continue producing equipment that operators must modify or discard to survive. The lessons of that encounter continue resonating in special operations communities, where the tension between standardization and adaptation remains unresolved. Every new piece of equipment issued by centralized procurement systems faces the same basic question that the Australian sergeant posed in 1967. Does this actually help operators accomplish their missions? Or does it merely satisfy institutional requirements that have no connection to operational reality? The answers are rarely as clear as they were in that dusty base camp. But the question itself has become permanent. And somewhere in classified archives, a report detailing everything the Green Beret learned from Australian methods sits unread, a monument to institutional resistance that cost lives and delayed reforms that eventually proved essential. The survival kit he was told to throw away has been replaced many times over, but the bureaucratic processes that produced it continue functioning largely unchanged. The Australian methods that generated such superior results have been studied, documented, and partially adopted, but the institutional culture that made those methods possible remains foreign to military organizations built on different assumptions. The gap between American and Australian approaches has narrowed considerably since 1967, but it hasn't closed entirely. American special operators today would recognize many Australian techniques as standard practice, evidence of how thoroughly the lessons of Vietnam eventually penetrated institutional resistance. But they would also recognize persistent tensions between operational flexibility and procedural compliance that their predecessors would find wearily familiar. The Australian sergeant's verdict on American survival equipment has become something of a legend in special operations circles, repeated in various forms whenever operators encounter gear that serves institutional purposes rather than operational needs. Throw that trash away has become shorthand for the broader critique of military procurement that prioritizes documentation over effectiveness. The phrase carries weight precisely because it came from soldiers whose methods proved superior to the systems they were criticizing. Whether American military institutions ever fully absorbed the lessons embedded in that simple dismissal remains an open question. The pressures that produced inadequate survival kits in the 1960s continue operating today, driven by bureaucratic incentives and industrial relationships that resist reform. Every generation of special operators discovers anew the gap between what institutions provide and what operations require. Every generation develops workarounds and modifications that eventually filter back to influence official procurement without ever fully resolving the underlying tension. The Green Beret, who stood holding his suddenly worthless equipment on that hot afternoon in Vietnam, was witnessing something larger than a tactical correction. He was seeing a clash between two conceptions of military professionalism that would define special operations debates for decades. One conception trusted procedures, documentation, and centralized expertise to produce optimal solutions. The other trusted individual operators to adapt standard solutions to specific circumstances they alone could fully understand. Both conceptions had merits. Both had limitations. But in the specific context of counterinsurgency operations against an adaptive enemy in complex terrain, the Australian approach proved decisively superior. The evidence accumulated over years of comparative operational results that institutional resistance could delay but never entirely suppress. That evidence sits today in archives across multiple countries, available to historians who care to examine it. The story it tells challenges comfortable assumptions about military effectiveness and institutional competence. It suggests that smaller, less sophisticated forces can outperform larger, more advanced opponents under certain circumstances. It indicates that individual judgment can exceed collective process when conditions favor adaptation over standardization. It demonstrates that allies sometimes possess wisdom that great powers would do well to heed rather than dismiss. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment returned from Vietnam with a combat record that remains remarkable by any standard. Their kill ratios, their casualty figures, their operational achievements all testified to methods that deserved wider study and adoption. The Americans who served alongside them came back with lessons that could have transformed military effectiveness if institutional barriers hadn't delayed their implementation. The survival kit incident was merely one small episode in this larger story, a moment when fundamental differences in military philosophy crystallized around a concrete object that one soldier could hold in his hands. But small episodes sometimes illuminate large truths in ways that abstract analysis cannot match. The American standing with his expensive, useless equipment and the Australian dismissing it with 5 contemptuous words captured something essential about why some military organizations succeed, while others struggle despite superior resources. Throw that trash away. The advice was specific to one survival kit on one afternoon in one war. But the principle extended far beyond that moment, challenging assumptions that military institutions are still grappling to address. The Australians had figured something out that their American allies needed years to accept. What they figured out wasn't complicated. It wasn't secret. It wasn't dependent on resources or technology that Americans lacked. It was simply the recognition that warfare is ultimately a human activity that human judgment must guide. Systems and procedures have their place, but they cannot substitute for the wisdom that experienced operators accumulate through direct contact with operational reality. The soldier on the ground knows things that analysts in distant headquarters cannot access. Trusting that knowledge, empowering it, building institutions that channel it rather than suppress it, was the Australian advantage that no amount of American technology could match. The Green Beret eventually understood this. Many of his colleagues did as well. Together, over decades, they worked to reshape American special operations in ways that honored the lessons they'd learned from Australian teachers. The transformation was slow, incomplete, and never officially acknowledged as borrowing from Commonwealth allies. But it was real, and its effects continue shaping military operations today. The Australian sergeant who delivered the original lesson probably never knew how far his influence would extend. He was simply doing what good non-commissioned officers have always done, sharing hard-won knowledge with less experienced soldiers who needed it. The fact that this particular knowledge transfer crossed national boundaries and challenged institutional assumptions was incidental to his immediate purpose of keeping a fellow professional alive in hostile territory. But incidents have consequences that participants cannot foresee. The 5 words spoken on that afternoon in 1967 became part of a larger transformation in military thinking that continues unfolding today. The survival kit that was dismissed as trash became a symbol of institutional dysfunction that reform efforts still cite as evidence of the need for change. The relationship between American and Australian special operations forces that produced that encounter became a model for the integrated Allied approach that now defines Western military cooperation. All of this from one Australian sergeant, one American Green Beret, and one collection of Pentagon-approved equipment that proved worthless when it mattered most. The story deserves remembering not for its drama, but for its insight into how military institutions change, or fail to change, in response to operational evidence. The Australian methods that proved superior in Vietnam didn't win immediate acceptance because institutional barriers prevented their adoption, but they won eventual acceptance because reality is stubborn, and methods that work consistently eventually overcome methods that merely satisfy bureaucratic requirements. The survival kit has been redesigned many times since 1967. Each revision reflected lessons learned at costs that earlier adoption might have avoided. Each revision brought American equipment closer to the standards that Australian operators had already achieved through less formal processes. Each revision testified to the eventual triumph of operational reality over institutional resistance. But the fundamental tension remains unresolved. Military organizations continue struggling to balance standardization with adaptation, centralized expertise with distributed judgment, procedural compliance with operational effectiveness. The Australian solution to this tension, trusting experienced operators to modify standard approaches based on circumstances they alone can fully assess, remains controversial in hierarchical institutions built on different assumptions. The Green Beret, who witnessed this solution in action, became one of many veterans who carried its lessons forward through careers that shaped institutional evolution. His contribution, like the contributions of his Australian teachers, has been largely forgotten by official histories that credit abstract forces rather than individual insight. But the changes he helped initiate remain visible in how American special operations forces train, equip, and employ their personnel today. The trash he was told to throw away has long since disappeared. The lessons embedded in that advice endure. And in quiet corners of special operations training facilities, instructors still tell variations of the story to new generations of operators, learning to distinguish between what institutions provide and what operations require. The Australian sergeant has become something of a legendary figure, his 5 words repeated as wisdom that transcends the specific context of their original delivery. The Green Beret who received that wisdom has merged with countless similar figures in the collective memory of special operations culture, but the insight they shared remains vital and relevant. Military effectiveness ultimately depends on soldiers who can adapt to circumstances that no headquarters can fully anticipate. Institutions that empower such adaptation outperform institutions that constrain it, regardless of their respective resource levels. The Australians demonstrated this truth in Vietnam. The Americans eventually learned it through painful experience that earlier openness might have avoided. Throw that trash away. The advice was sound in 1967. It remains sound today. And it will remain sound as long as military organizations struggle to bridge the gap between what their systems produce and what their missions require. The survival kit incident matters not because it was unique, but because it was representative. Similar encounters occurred throughout the American-Australian relationship during Vietnam, each revealing the same basic dynamic of institutional resistance to operational evidence. Together, these encounters produced a body of experience that eventually transformed American special operations, despite never receiving official acknowledgement. The transformation continues today, driven by veterans who learned from Australian colleagues and by institutional reforms that finally caught up with operational reality. The gap between American and Australian methods has narrowed considerably, though differences remain that reflect different organizational cultures and historical experiences. The relationship between the two special operations communities has evolved from grudging professional respect into genuine partnership based on shared operational understanding. None of this would have happened without the small encounters that challenged American assumptions and planted seeds of change in receptive minds. The survival kit dismissal was one such encounter. There were many others, each contributing something to the eventual transformation that would reshape American military capability. The Australian sergeant who delivered the original verdict deserves recognition that historical accounts have largely denied him. His 5 words captured a truth that institutions needed years to accept. His willingness to share hard knowledge with an ally who might not welcome it demonstrated the professional ethic that special operations forces at their best embody. His confidence that methods proven effective would eventually overcome methods merely approved official reflected faith in operational reality that events would vindicate. Throw that trash away, mate. The advice echoes across decades, still relevant, still challenging, still pointing toward truths that military institutions are still learning to embrace. The equipment has changed, the methods have evolved, the wars have shifted to different theaters with different enemies, but the fundamental insight remains constant. What works in actual operations matters more than what satisfies institutional requirements. Soldiers who understand their environment judge better than systems that standardize across diverse conditions. Trust in professional judgment produces superior results to compliance with procedural mandates. The Australians knew this in 1967. The Americans know it now. The journey between those 2 points of understanding cost more than it should have, delayed by institutional barriers that hindsight reveals as tragic. But the journey was completed, and the lessons it produced remain available to future generations who will face similar challenges of institutional reform. The survival kit sits somewhere in historical memory, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the approach it represented. The Australian methods that replaced it have become mainstream practice, their origins largely forgotten by operators who implement them without knowing their history. The Green Beret who received the original lesson has merged with countless similar figures into the collective legacy of special operations transformation. But the story endures because it captures something true about how military knowledge evolves. The small encounters matter as much as the large battles. The informal exchanges shape institutions as powerfully as official doctrine revisions. The wisdom of experienced sergeants deserves respect that hierarchical systems often deny it. Throw that trash away. The words still resonate because the truth they expressed still applies. Military effectiveness depends on soldiers who know their business and institutions wise enough to trust them. The Australians built such institutions. The Americans eventually followed. The world is marginally better defended because that exchange occurred, and its lessons were eventually absorbed. The survival kit incident deserves its place in special operations history, not as drama, but as education. What the Australian sergeant knew, what the American Green Beret learned, what the decades of institutional resistance eventually yielded to, all point toward enduring principles that transcend the specific circumstances of their discovery. The equipment may be trash. The lessons never were.